Hello, welcome to History Tea, a channel where I spill the tea on history. Today's video will be about Mileva Marić, the first wife of Albert Einstein, who was also a genius and maybe even the brains behind some of his work. Before I start, I just want to let y'all know that I will be pronouncing many things wrong in this video. I'm just gonna go right through, and if I pronounce them wrong, then sorry, but you know. Buckle up, it's gonna be a bumpy ride. Mileva Marić was born into a rich family in Marital, Serbia on December 19, 1875. Her parents were Miloš Marić and Marija Rušić Marić. She was the oldest of 3 children. Miloš and Marija knew that Mileva was unique from a young age. Thankfully, her father was seemingly progressive and helped her get an education. At the time, a woman who got a higher than average education usually had her father to thank. Well, the good old days when a woman couldn't learn math without the consent of several men. Mileva was actually very quiet and reserved, and I think this was a product, or at least partially a product, of her limp. She had congenital hip dislocation, or CHD, which basically means that her hip didn't develop properly as a fetus, and it's just prone to dislocating. And unfortunately, it's a condition that only gets worse with age. Mileva was a genius from the start. She attended 2 secondary schools, one in Novi Sad and another in Sremska Mitrovica, starting in 1886. Then in 1890, she attended the Royal Serbian Grammar School in Sebac. Her father worked in the courts in Zagreb, Croatia, and got special permission for her to attend the all-male Royal Classical High School as long as she passed the entrance exam, which she did in 1892, allowing her to enter the 10th grade. While she was there, she was allowed to attend physics lectures, and she graduated in 1894 at the top of her class in mathematics and physics. In the same year, she started at the Girls' High School in Zurich, Switzerland. Then in 1896, for only 1 semester, she studied medicine at the University of Zurich. Later that year, she tested into the Zurich Polytechnic, now the ETH, and started the diploma course to teach mathematics and physics. She was the only woman in a class of 5, and Albert Einstein was one of her classmates. They bonded over their love for physics and became virtually inseparable, even to the point that Mileva's friends were actually a little jealous of Albert. Mileva decided to attend Heidelberg University in Germany for the winter semester of 1897 to 98, later returning to Zurich Polytechnic, where she took a total of 7 courses consisting of differential and integral calculus, descriptive and projective geometry, mechanics, theoretical physics, applied physics, experimental physics, and finally, astronomy. Just reading her course list gives me a headache. In 1900, Mileva took her diploma exam and failed with a grade average of 4.0 on a scale of 1 to 6. She retook the exam the following year, but failed again with the same score. This time, though, she was 3 months pregnant. Suffering from morning sickness and praying that your school board doesn't find out that you're pregnant with an illegitimate child, all while trying to take a very important test, just sounds like a recipe for disaster to me. Mileva married Albert in 1903 in Bern, Switzerland, despite protests from his mom. See, his mom, Pauline Einstein, basically thought that Mileva was an ugly old tart with a limp and that she was too ambitious. By the way, Mileva was 21 and Albert was 17 when they first met. But anyway, despite his mom, his dad agreed, or gave him permission to marry, so he did. Albert worked in a patent office during the day while Mileva took on a more domestic role, but at night they would come together and work at their kitchen table on physics. This went on for a few years, and Albert even had his Olympia Academy, which was basically a bunch of local physicists getting together and discussing and debating things, and she would sit in on those meetings. I don't know that she ever participated just because she was so shy, but according to members of the Olympia Academy who attended those meetings, she visibly understood what they were talking about. Then, in 1911, they moved to Prague for Albert's work as a teacher, before moving to Zurich again a year later for another teaching position. In April of 1914, the Einsteins moved to Berlin, again for Albert's work, and Mileva did not want to go, and she certainly did not want to stay there. At this point, Albert had already grown cold towards Mileva, and he had already started his affair with his first cousin and second wife, Elsa. Mileva wanted to make the marriage work for the sake of their sons, and Albert agreed to try as long as she followed his list of rules. Now, I'm going to read you his list of conditions, but prepare yourself because it's horrible. A, you will make sure, 1, that my clothes and laundry are kept in good order, 2, that I will receive 3 meals regularly in my room, 3, that my bedroom and study are kept neat, and especially that my desk is left for my use only. B, you will renounce all personal relations with me insofar as they are not completely necessary for social reasons. Specifically, you will forego 1, my sitting at home with you, 2, my going out or traveling with you. C, you will obey the following points in your relations with me. 1, you will not expect any intimacy from me, nor will you reproach me in any way. 2, you will stop talking to me if I request it. And 3, you will leave my bedroom or study immediately without protest if I request it. Gross! Mileva tried to obey his atrocious rules but couldn't in the end, and I don't blame her. That's not a wife, that's a maid. Fortunately, marriages like that were very common back then, and actually they were common not that long ago, and I'm sure some still exist today. Mileva took her 2 sons and left Albert to go back to Zurich in 1914, hoping that he would soon follow her. He didn't. He was in tears at the train station when they left though, so at least that says something. After years of Mileva refusing to grant Albert a divorce, he finally bribed her with his Nobel Prize money if or when he should receive it. She accepted this, and finally, on February 14th, 1919, they divorced. Valentine's Day. How romantic. Life after Albert was rough for Mileva. She not only lost her husband, but she also lost her connection to science. After failing her diploma exam twice, Albert was really her only connection to the world that she loved and excelled in. So no living with Albert meant no working on science with Albert, or at all. Okay, now I'm gonna get to the real point of this video. Did Mileva Marić contribute to Einstein's work? Personally, I think it's a no-brainer. Yes, she did. With everything I've read, you'd be foolish to think that she didn't in any way. No, there's no photographic evidence or any videos of them collaborating. Why would there be? But there are the letters between them. It's in their own words. They confirm that they work together. And I mean, there's plenty of eyewitness accounts as well, and stories passed down, and those cannot be considered hard evidence, of course. But the letters. Let's start from the beginning. They met in school, where they worked together all the time. Debated over things, discussed things. Albert was unfocused, and Mileva kept him on track. Then they married and worked together every night. Several people have attested to this, including their oldest son, Hans Albert. At one point, they visited Mileva's family in Novi Sad, and it was reported that they debated over E=mc² in the garden. It was also said that Mileva talked to her father about their work together. Now, of course, these are just verbal stories passed down, so they can't count as hard evidence, but I still thought that they were important to note. In one of the letters from Albert to Mileva, he references our work while talking about the theory of relative motion. His exact words were, "How happy and proud will I be when the two of us together will have brought our work on relative motion to a victorious conclusion." Now, certain historians still don't see this as proof. I guess they think that him saying "our" was more as a courtesy to Mileva than her actually helping him, but that doesn't make any sense. So they also say that he would talk about science a lot in his letters and she wouldn't, and she would just talk about mundane things, which is untrue. She did talk about science in her letters occasionally. But you also have to remember that out of the letters found, most of them were Albert to Mileva, and a lot of her letters are still missing. To me, this sounds like what I like to call a textbook historian, because they're the ones that won't take in new information and evidence simply because they have grown used to a story that they've heard and researched, and they don't want it to change, just like a school textbook. Something I saw talked about a lot in my research was the story of a Russian physicist named Abram Jaffe, who claimed to have seen the early copies of the 1905 papers where the author name was Einstein Marić, Marić as in marriage. But even if he did see that, it doesn't mean that Mileva also had her name on it, because in Switzerland it was a custom for the men to take the wife's maiden name onto their name formally, and since Albert was married to Mileva in Switzerland, that may be why that was on there. But even with that, there is no evidence to prove that, so. However, there is evidence of Albert relying on Mileva for support and guidance. In one letter he wrote, "Without you, I lack self-confidence, pleasure, and work." It's also said that Albert said, "I need my wife as she solves all the mathematical problems for me." There's no hard evidence, but I do believe I heard that Mileva confirmed this later in life. But besides that, it does make sense if you think about the fact that Albert was dyslexic and Mileva scored higher than him in math. In 1897, Mileva sent Albert a letter about a lecture she had attended at Heidelberg University. This letter later influenced his paper on Brownian motion. In 1905, Albert was quoted saying, "For everything that I achieved in my life, I must thank Mileva. She is my genius inspirer, my protector against the hardships of life and science. Without her, my work would never have been started nor finished." You may be wondering why Mileva's name wasn't on anything if she did contribute. Well, there are many possible reasons, one of them being the fact that a woman's name on something, especially something science-related, may discredit it. That was extremely plausible back then. Or there's the theory that Mileva saw her and Albert as one entity. In 1908, the two of them worked together with Conrad Habichet to build the ultra-sensitive light voltmeter, and it was patented under Einstein Habichet. And supposedly, when Habichet asked Mileva why she didn't want to put her name on it, she said, "Why? The two of us are but one stone." And that's an interesting theory because it does kind of make sense. I don't know how. I don't think there's any hard evidence of that. Again, I think it was just like a story passed down. But it is interesting, regardless. Whether Mileva helped Albert directly or just by sharing ideas and keeping him focused, she still helped. She still played an important role in science that changed the course of history, and she deserves to be known for that. Besides the loss of the two loves of her life, Albert and science, Mileva fell into deep financial trouble. In 1922, she received Albert's Nobel Prize money, which that's a whole other long story that I'm not going to get into because no one has the time for it, but if you want to, you can research it on your own, or I might post some stuff about it on Instagram and Facebook. But after receiving that money, she invested the money into an apartment building in Zurich, in a rich part of Zurich. And I'm not exactly sure how much money she got because Albert complicated it in the process of trying to keep it a secret that he was giving his ex-wife the money. But I know that initially he was given 121,572 Swedish krona, which he then turned into German marks and then into Swiss francs. And I did the math, and by today's currency, changing it from Swedish krona to German marks lowered the amount to 22,800, and lowering it and taking it from German marks to Swiss francs lowered it to 13,043. So in the process of trying to cover up something that everyone knows about anyway, he significantly lowered the amount. In 1930, Mileva's youngest son, Edward, who was about 20 at the time, was diagnosed with schizophrenia. She didn't want him to be committed, understandably. I mean, sanatoriums were horrendous back then. So she spent all the money she could getting the best medical care she could get. She even went as far as to sometimes have a bodyguard on duty to protect her during Edward's outbursts. A lot went on financially for the rest of Mileva's life, and I'm not going to get too specific just because none of us have 3 hours to deep dive into it, but I will give you a quick timeline. In 1922, she received the Nobel Prize money. And in 1923, Albert transferred money into an American bank account and invested in a number of dollar bonds under Mileva's name. In 1924, she bought an apartment building in a rich part of Zurich where she lived with her sons and collected money from renters. In the late 1920s, Mileva and Edward lived a fairly comfortable life thanks to the rental income, interest from her American bonds, and a few small loans. In 1930, her American bonds reached their maturity date and needed to be reinvested. Albert suggested she invest in another property since it worked out so well the first time, and by the end of the year she had purchased 2 more buildings. In the same year, Edward Einstein was diagnosed with schizophrenia and she needed to pay for his care. Sometime between 1930 and 1932, the economic crisis reached Switzerland and Mileva's renters could no longer pay on time or at all. Albert tried to help her by hiring a lawyer to sort out her finances, but the lawyer wanted Mileva to sell the properties fast and for whatever she could get, and she did not agree with that. In 1933 to 1938, Albert's sometimes small and inconsistent financial contributions weren't helping enough, and Mileva's debt continued to grow. In 1936, the income she was receiving from 2 of her buildings wasn't enough to cover the cost of running them or the mortgages, and they had to be foreclosed on. In 1938, before Mileva's only remaining building, the one she lived in, could be foreclosed on, she had Albert take it over into his name. and I wasn't able to find anything after that, so I'm gonna assume that she lived in that building until her death. In April or May of 1948, Edward suffered from one of his violent outbursts where he would smash everything he could. At the same time, Mileva had a nervous breakdown and had to be hospitalized. While at the hospital, her buzzer had to be disconnected because she called the nurses so many times trying to get herself transferred to Bergolsli Sanatorium, which her son Edward had visited on many occasions. I'm assuming she knew that he was there and she wanted to be with her son and make sure that he was okay. I don't think she ever was transferred there, and 3 months later, on August 4th, 1948, after suffering from several strokes, Mileva died. Okay, I know they've been casually mentioning Mileva's children here and there without really getting into it, so let's get into it. I'm going to start with her sons. In 1904, Mileva had her first son, Hans Albert. I don't know too much about him, but he grew up, got married in 1927, had a family, and then moved to America, where he worked as a professor at Berkeley. Mileva had her second son, Edward, in 1910. I pretty much said everything there is to say about him, except for the fact that Albert supposedly said that Edward was his more refined son. Now, you probably remember me mentioning Mileva being pregnant with an illegitimate child earlier, and you're like, Jamie, you gonna elaborate? Yes, I am. 2 words, Lisl Einstein. After failing her second diploma exam, Mileva traveled home to Novi Sad to have her and Albert's illegitimate baby that was conceived during a trip to Lake Como, Italy. On January 27, 1902, Lisl was born, and a year later, at the age of 1, she suffered from scarlet fever. Now, this is where it gets a little wild, because we don't really know what happened to Lisl after that, but there are several theories. 1, she died from scarlet fever. 2, she survived the scarlet fever and was adopted. Or 3, my personal favorite, she survived the scarlet fever and was adopted by Mileva's best friend, Helena Savich. Supposedly, one of Helena's daughters told her son that there are things in the letters between Mileva and Helena that are best not talked about. I love a mystery. I choose to believe this theory strictly because it has a happier ending. To wrap up this video, I just want to say that Mileva Marić was an amazing woman regardless of how much she contributed to Albert's work. The very fact that she got the education she did and reached genius status as a woman in the Victorian and Edwardian eras is a triumph on its own. And she deserves to be recognized for that. And that's the tea on history. Thank you for watching my video. I hope you learned something new. If you want to see more, make sure to like and subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified when I upload new videos, and you can also follow all of my social medias that will be linked in the description box below. I will also be linking a video that I watched on Mileva that I thought was really interesting, so if you want more Mileva, you can watch that. Should I do mukbangs? History mukbangs. No. Maybe. Yeah. No.